Imagine standing in the driveway of the house where you spent the last 6 months holding your dying husband's hand, watching his mother change the locks while your maternity bags are piled at your feet in the rain. That was the moment I understood something I had been too exhausted, too grief-stricken, too pregnant to see clearly. Some people don't wait for you to stop crying before they start taking. My mother-in-law's hand was on the deadbolt before the funeral flowers had even wilted, and my brother-in-law was already on the phone with a realtor. What they did not know, what they could not possibly have imagined, was that the woman they shoved into the rain with 42 weeks of pregnancy and nowhere to go was about to become the most powerful person in every room they would ever enter again. My husband Daniel had been sick for 14 months before he died. Brain tumor, the aggressive kind, the kind that gives you a diagnosis and a timeline in the same breath. We had been married for 3 years when the doctors told us. I was 27, he was 31. We had a small apartment, a dog named Pepper, and enough love between us to fill something much larger than either of us knew. When the hospital visits became weekly, then daily, we moved into the family estate, his mother Patricia's sprawling colonial outside of Charlotte, because Patricia insisted, because Daniel needed around-the-clock care, and because I believed, in the way only a person who has never been deliberately betrayed believes, that family was a sanctuary. Patricia had never been warm to me. In the years before Daniel got sick, her coolness was something I chalked up to personality, to a mother's possessiveness over her son. She found reasons to redirect his attention. She scheduled family dinners on our anniversary. She introduced me to her friends as Daniel's wife in a tone that made it clear she considered that my entire identity, and possibly a temporary one. But after the diagnosis, something shifted in her. She became attentive toward me in a way that felt rehearsed, like a woman learning lines for a role she had auditioned for many times. She brought me tea I didn't ask for. She asked about my pregnancy. Daniel and I had found out I was expecting 3 weeks after the diagnosis, with a smile that never quite reached the part of her eyes that mattered. Her son, Marcus, my brother-in-law, was worse. He didn't bother with the performance. He watched me the way someone watches a clock when they need to be somewhere else. Daniel passed on a Tuesday morning in October. I was beside him. I held his hand until there was no longer anything to hold, and then I sat in that chair for a long time after, because I did not know how to stand up and walk into a world that did not have him in it. When I finally came downstairs, Patricia and Marcus were already in the study. The door was open just enough that I could hear the word estate before Marcus noticed me and closed it. I told myself it was grief. I told myself people process loss in strange ways. I told myself a lot of things in the weeks that followed, because telling yourself things is sometimes the only way to survive the days you are not equipped to live through. 3 weeks after the funeral, Patricia asked me to sit down at the kitchen table. She poured herself coffee and did not offer me any. She placed a folder in front of me. She said, with the kind of practiced calm that people use when they have rehearsed what they're going to say at least a dozen times, that the estate had been reviewed and that the house and its holdings had transferred to her under Daniel's will. She said the legal team had confirmed it. She said she understood this was difficult timing given my condition, but she needed me to make arrangements to find alternative housing within 30 days. I stared at her. I was 8 months pregnant. My husband had been dead for 21 days. I told her I didn't understand. Daniel and I had talked about the future. He had told me everything would be taken care of. Patricia's expression didn't shift by a single degree. What Daniel wanted and what Daniel's legal documents specified were 2 different things, she said. Marcus appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, wearing an expression that told me he had been listening from the hall. He said it gently, almost kindly, which made it worse. He said perhaps I could stay with my parents while I figured things out. My parents lived in Phoenix. I had not spoken to my father in 4 years, not since he made clear that Daniel, the son of a family he considered above our station, was not someone he intended to welcome. My mother had passed when I was 19. I had no one in Charlotte except the life Daniel and I had built, and Patricia was dismantling it in the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. I asked for a copy of the documents. Patricia said the family's attorney would be in touch. I asked when. She said soon. Marcus walked out of the kitchen, and that was the end of the conversation. 2 weeks later, the new locks appeared. Not when I was out running an errand. When I was at my 36-week prenatal appointment, 40 minutes from the house, I came back to find my suitcases, my boxes, and a garbage bag of miscellaneous things stacked under the covered porch. The rain started about 20 minutes after I arrived. Patricia did not answer the door. Marcus's car was in the driveway and the lights were on in the study. I rang the bell 5 times. I sat on the porch step with my hand resting on my stomach and listened to the rain, and tried to understand what kind of person does this to a woman who is 36 weeks pregnant with her dead son's child, and I could not find the logic, which means it was not about logic. It was about what they wanted, and they had decided I was an obstacle. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the cold to get inside my coat, long enough for the sky to go from gray to dark, long enough for my daughter to shift inside me in a way that reminded me, quietly and firmly, that I had someone else to think about now. I called a car. I went to the only extended stay hotel within my budget, checked into a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, sat on the edge of the bed, and cried until there was nothing left. Then I opened my phone and looked up the number Daniel had made me memorize the previous spring, when he was still strong enough to make plans. He had held my face in both of his hands and made me repeat it back to him 3 times. "Call Richard if anything happens to me before I can tell you everything myself," he said. I had thought he meant something about medications, about hospice logistics. I had not understood he meant something else entirely. Richard Calloway picked up on the second ring as though he had been expecting me for months. Because, as I would learn, he had been. He arrived at the hotel within the hour. He was a slight man in his late 50s with silver hair and a methodical stillness about him, the kind of person who carries information carefully, the way you carry something fragile across a long distance. He sat across from me in the 2 chairs by the window and he said, "I have been waiting for your call, and I am sorry it had to come under these circumstances, but I am relieved you are safe." I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he set a folder on the table between us and said there was something I needed to know about my husband, and about what my husband had built. Daniel had founded a software infrastructure company 8 years before we met. He had built it quietly, methodically, funding it himself through years of contract work and reinvested revenue, keeping it out of the family's awareness because he had understood his mother's relationship to money long before I had. The company had grown. It had grown significantly. At the time of Daniel's death, its valuation stood at $1.8 billion. Daniel had structured the ownership, early and deliberately, entirely in my name. I heard the number and I said nothing for a very long time. Richard waited. He was a patient man. I finally asked why. "Why in my name?" Richard slid a single page across the table, a letter, handwritten. In the slanted, careful script I had memorized from birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on my pillow. "Mia," it began. "If Richard is sitting across from you right now, then I ran out of time before I could sit across from you myself, and I am sorry for that more than I know how to write. What I built for you. Not for my name, not for my family. For you and for whoever you were carrying when I had to leave. They will try to tell you that you have nothing. I need you to know, before you believe them, that the opposite is true. You have everything. Please let Richard help you understand what that means. All my love. Always, Daniel." I pressed the letter against my chest and breathed through the kind of grief that lives below words, the kind that settles in the bones and stays. Richard sat quietly and let me have the moment. He did not rush me. When I looked up, his expression was one of careful, professional compassion. But underneath it, something else, a resolve that told me he took what Daniel had built as seriously as the man who built it. I asked him what happened now. He said that was entirely up to me. My daughter was born 11 days later, in a hospital room with Richard's assistant in the waiting room because I had no one else to call, and I held her for the first time and understood completely why Daniel had made those plans. She had his eyes, dark, steady, looking at the world like it was a thing worth paying attention to. I named her Clara. In the weeks that followed, I healed, and I listened, and I learned. Richard brought people to the hotel suite that had become our temporary home, my daughter and I in one room, a small army of quiet, competent people cycling through the other. There was a financial analyst named Sophia, who walked me through the company's structure in clear, patient segments, without condescension, as though she had been briefed that I was intelligent and simply uninformed. There was an attorney named James who specialized in estate litigation, and who explained, with a flatness that told me he had seen this pattern many times, that Patricia and Marcus had likely known about Daniel's assets for years, which was why they had moved so quickly after he died. The will they showed me, the one that transferred the house to Patricia, had been drafted 3 years earlier and had not been updated. It governed the house, the cars, the personal accounts. It said nothing about the company because Daniel had kept those documents entirely separate, handled exclusively by Richard, never filed anywhere Patricia's attorneys would think to look. Patricia and Marcus did not know I owned a billion-dollar company. They thought they had taken everything from me. I asked Richard how long they had before they realized I had survived the eviction, and he said, given their behavior so far, they would probably reach out when they needed something. He was right. It took 9 days. Marcus called me on a Tuesday morning, his tone hovering somewhere between performative concern and practiced charm. He said Patricia had been worrying about me. He said they wanted to know where the baby had landed and whether she was healthy. He said things like, family, and of course, and, naturally, words he deployed the way someone deploys a tool with precision, without feeling. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that there were some assets of Daniel's they were still working through legally, and that it would be helpful, for everyone, if I could sign a few documents releasing my claim to anything that might be contested. I let him talk. I didn't ask what documents. I didn't express alarm. I said I needed some time to look things over with my own attorney, and Marcus's voice shifted in a way that told me this was not the answer he had expected. He said, of course, take your time, but also that these things moved on legal timelines, and it would be better for me not to wait too long. I thanked him and ended the call. Richard was already at the table across from me. I told him what Marcus had said. Richard nodded once, unsurprised, and said, now we begin. What followed was 6 weeks of preparation so thorough it felt like learning a second language. I studied the company's structure, its board, its executive team, its strategic position. I read Daniel's notes. There were hundreds of pages of them, organized in binders with his handwriting on the tabs, the same handwriting that had told me everything would be okay. He had anticipated this. He had written guides for me, not corporate memos but actual letters, narrated in his voice, explaining things the way he would have explained them over coffee, with patience and the occasional joke at his own expense. The first time I opened one and heard his voice in my head reading it, I had to close it for a while. But I opened it again. I met the company's leadership team in a conference room on the 38th floor of a building in downtown Charlotte. I arrived in a dark blazer, Clara in a carrier against my chest, Richard and Sophia flanking me like they had been doing this for years, because Richard had been doing this for years. He introduced me as Daniel's wife and the company's sole owner, and the room went very still in the way that rooms go still when something important shifts. An older woman named Helen, the chief operating officer, looked at me for a long moment and then said, we knew he had someone worth building this for. We just didn't know when we'd get to meet you. I did not cry, though it was close. I spent the following weeks absorbing everything I could. The learning was dense but not impossible. I had worked in project management for 5 years before Clara, and the instinct for structure, for identifying what mattered and what didn't, translated in ways I hadn't expected. At one point during a briefing, a senior executive looked up from his notes and said, you ask better questions than most people who've been in these rooms for a decade, and I thought about every time Patricia had sighed when I spoke at the dinner table, every time Marcus had talked over me on holidays, every time I had been made to feel like a person who was merely passing through someone else's more important life. I was not passing through. I had been here the whole time. It was during the 5th week that Richard told me Patricia and Marcus had filed a petition. I was sitting in the hotel suite feeding Clara when he knocked and came in with his tablet and the expression he wore when the news required care in the delivery. They were claiming I had abandoned the family estate that I had left voluntarily, that I had been unstable following Daniel's death, that there were concerns about my capacity to make sound decisions regarding the assets Daniel had left behind. They were seeking a financial guardianship, a legal mechanism that would have placed a trustee nominated by them over any decisions I made regarding the estate. I read the filing. I read it slowly, every word, and I recognized the pattern underneath it, the same narrative Patricia had tried to build from the moment Daniel got sick. Mia is fragile. Mia is overwhelmed. Mia is not equipped. I had heard variations of it at every holiday dinner, in every sideways comment, in the way Patricia answered questions meant for me, and the way Marcus spoke about my career as though it were a charming hobby. I set the tablet down. I looked at Clara, who was looking back at me with those dark, patient eyes. "Not this time," I said. "Not ever again." Richard said he needed me to understand something about the process. The judge assigned to the petition was known to be sympathetic to established family structures, to legacy names, to people who presented as stable and rooted. Patricia and Marcus would walk in with decades of Charlotte social capital. I would walk in as the widow they had locked out of a house in the rain. "The facts were on my side," he said. "But facts need a frame, and we were going to build the strongest possible frame." I said, "Then let's build it." We worked through the evidence methodically. Richard had, on my behalf, quietly obtained the security footage from the neighbor's camera at the corner of the estate property, a wide-angle system that captured the driveway. It showed my suitcases on the porch. It showed my car arriving in the rain. It showed the lights inside the house, the shadow of someone moving past the study window while I rang the bell. It showed me sitting on the porch step for 47 minutes before the car arrived. It showed all of it with a timestamp that did not lie. There was also the voicemail. 12 days before Daniel died, Marcus had called me while I was in the hospital chapel, and I had missed it. I had never listened to it. In the fog of those final days, a missed call from Marcus had ranked somewhere near the bottom of what I could manage to address. But Richard had, as part of his preparation, combed through everything. And the voicemail was still there. 9 seconds of Marcus talking to someone else in the background, not realizing the call had connected. "Just get her out fast," he was saying to someone, "before she has time to find an attorney." 9 seconds. That was all. The morning of the petition hearing, I dressed in charcoal gray, put Clara in her carrier, and walked into the courthouse beside Richard with the specific kind of calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having moved through it so many times, it no longer surprises you. Patricia and Marcus were already seated. Patricia wore black, still in mourning clothes, performing grief for the room. Marcus had a different attorney today, someone expensive and polished. They turned when I entered, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw it cross Marcus's face. Not guilt. Something closer to recalculation. The judge was a compact, serious man named Hargrove who moved through procedure with the efficiency of someone who had heard many stories and retained the habit of skepticism about all of them. Patricia's attorney presented their case in the language of concern, a young widow, clearly struggling, no family support system, potentially vulnerable to outside influence given the significant financial complexities involved. When it was Richard's turn, he was quiet for exactly 3 seconds before he spoke, which I had learned was something he did deliberately, to make the room lean in. He presented the security footage first. The courtroom was silent as the footage played the rain, the bags, the 47 minutes, the light moving behind the window, then the voicemail. Marcus's voice in that room was a different kind of silence, the kind that happens when a thing that was private becomes inescapably public. Patricia did not move. Marcus's jaw tightened and did not release. Then Richard presented the corporate documents, Daniel's company, the ownership structure, the valuation, the letter of intent, signed and witnessed 14 months ago, transferring everything to me. He presented it without theater, simply laying each document on the record like placing stones across a river, steady, deliberate, building a path that could not be walked back. The judge took longer with those documents than he had taken with anything else. Then he looked up. He said the petition was not only without merit but appeared to have been filed in direct service of the petitioner's financial interests rather than any genuine concern for my well-being. He dismissed it with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. He noted the voicemail evidence in terms that made clear it would have consequences beyond this hearing. He looked at Patricia and Marcus and said he hoped they understood the severity of what had been presented. Patricia's face was a controlled, bloodless white. Marcus stared at the table. I stood and held Clara close and breathed. Richard placed a hand briefly on my shoulder. His expression was the same one he always wore, measured, professional, but his eyes said something different. Daniel chose well, they said. They were waiting for me in the hallway. I had not expected that. Marcus stepped in front of me first, and I had to give him credit for his nerve, if nothing else. He said my name in a tone meant to suggest we were in the middle of a conversation that had already established some mutual ground. He said this didn't have to be the end of something. He said family. I stopped walking. I looked at him directly, the way I had practiced not doing for years, because looking at someone like Marcus directly had always felt like an invitation for worse. I said, "The last time I was on your property, it was raining, and I was 36 weeks pregnant, and you turned off the lights." He started to speak. I did not let him. I said, "I'm not interested in what you need from me now. I'm not interested in what you think family means after what you showed me it means. What I am going to do is build something Daniel believed in, and I am going to make sure my daughter grows up in a world where she never doubts that she is worth fighting for. That is what I owe her. I don't owe you anything." Patricia had come to stand beside Marcus. She was looking at Clara, at Daniel's eyes in Clara's face, and for a moment something moved across her expression that might, in different circumstances, have looked like grief. But grief and regret are not the same thing, and what I saw was not regret. It was the particular anguish of someone who has counted their assets and come up short. I said, "You should speak to your attorneys about the voicemail. I have nothing more to say to you." I walked out of the courthouse into a bright November morning, Clara against my chest, Richard a half step behind me, and I stood on the steps for a moment and let the sun be on my face, and I thought about Daniel making me memorize a phone number in the spring, holding my face in his hands, saying, "Call Richard if anything happens before I can tell you everything myself." And I thought about how he had known, how he had loved me in ways I was still discovering, and I was grateful and heartbroken and standing upright all at once, which is sometimes what surviving looks like. That was 4 years ago. I am sitting now in the corner office of a building that bears a name I chose, not Daniel's, not his family's, not a name meant to impress anyone, but the name I decided stood for what I wanted this company to be. Clara is downstairs in the building's child care center, currently involved in what the staff describe as an ongoing dispute about whether a particular purple crayon belongs to the general supply or exclusively to her. I have been informed she makes her case with significant conviction. I believe it. The company has grown since I took ownership. Not because I was born knowing how to run a billion-dollar organization, I was not, but because I hired people smarter than me in the areas where I needed them, and I listened more than I spoke, and I made decisions the way Daniel's letters taught me to, by asking not what serves the moment, but what builds something worth standing in 10 years from now. We have made acquisitions. We have expanded into 3 new markets. We have a foundation now, too, small but real, focused on legal support for women navigating estate disputes and inheritance challenges following the death of a spouse. Because the system that nearly swallowed me whole swallows other people every day, and I know what it feels like to sit in a hotel room with a newborn and no idea that anything will be okay. Richard is still my attorney. He has become something more than that too, a person who shows up on Clara's birthday with an age-inappropriate toy and the expression of someone who genuinely enjoys the chaos. He still won't tell me every detail of what he and Daniel discussed in those final months, and I have stopped asking, because I have come to understand that some of Daniel's gifts were the ones I received without knowing they were being given. I learned, about a year after the hearing, that Marcus was facing his own legal proceedings related to the voicemail and several other communications that came to light during discovery. I did not follow the proceedings closely. I did not celebrate when I heard the outcome. I felt something quieter than satisfaction, something closer to the absence of weight, the feeling of setting down something heavy you've carried so long you forgot it wasn't yours. Patricia sent a letter to my office 8 months ago. It was long. I read it once. She wrote about Daniel. She wrote some things that were true and some things that were not, and I could not always tell which was which told me that she couldn't always tell either. I did not respond, not because I am punishing her, Because there is nothing in that letter that asks for me, it asks for a version of me that still needed something from her. And that woman is gone. What I know now, sitting in this office with the sun through the window and my daughter's laughter drifting up from downstairs, is that Daniel was not naive when he made those plans. He was not a man given to wishful thinking. He built the structure he built because he believed I was the kind of person who could walk into a world that had taken everything from her and build something worth standing in. He was not wrong. He was right about me before I was right about myself, and that is a kind of love I am still learning the full shape of. I used to think the hardest part was the driveway in the rain. The 47 minutes on the porch step, the bags in the wet, the lights going off inside. I know now that the hardest part was everything that came after the learning, the days when I didn't know enough and had to keep going anyway, the moments when Clara looked at me with those eyes, and I understood that the only acceptable direction was forward. I was not broken by what they did to me. I was handed a reason to become someone they never saw coming. If you are sitting somewhere right now in the middle of what feels like the worst version of your life, if someone has just locked a door on you, metaphorically or literally, if you have been told you have nothing, and that the nothing is what you deserve, I want you to hear this. The people who do that to you are not seeing you clearly. They are seeing what they need you to be. And who you actually are is something they have never had access to. Clara is 4 now. Last week she told me that when she grows up she wants to be someone who helps. I asked her what kind of helping. She thought about it for a long time, in the way she thinks about things, with her father's dark eyes going still and patient. Then, she said, the kind where you go get someone when they're stuck. That's exactly it, I told her. That is exactly the kind.